So what constitutes a family? A couple, maybe some rugrats, and perhaps we could throw in some fur kids for good measure. Now, anyone that's had a brother or sister knows full well that having some sibling rivalry makes each one of the siblings perhaps a bit stronger out in the world. And being that we can focus on, say, the automotive family, maybe one from Korea that already has two siblings, perhaps it's high time they need the third to make all three a bit stronger. So let's kick this sibling rivalry off with some of the stuff we already know. There are going to be two engines on offer. You are not going to be surprised to hear that one of them will be the 2.5 turbocharged 4. The other will be the 3.5 twin turbocharged V6. So basically the same engines we've seen in the G80 and the GV80. Can't really tell you horsepower because they didn't release at least the horsepower figures for North America, but as a good guide, the turbocharged 4, that was 300 horsepower and 311 pound-feet of torque. And the 3.5 twin turbocharged V6 in other Genesis applications is tuned to 375 horsepower and 391 pound-feet of torque. The car you and I are playing around with today, that is indeed an all-wheel drive vehicle. Something else about it that's unique to this vehicle, it's a sport model. That is something you and I have not experienced in other Genesis vehicles. Frankly, you and I have kind of complained that even in the most sporty mode with the vehicles that have the adjustable dampers, they're not set up the right way. They're great for ride quality, kind of what a Genesis is going for, but they're not something that rivals like the middle-of-the-road AMGs. My guess, Albert Bierman and the folks at Genesis are trying to change that, because now with this sport model, there will be a Sport Plus mode. Again, didn't get all the details. They were kind of cagey about giving everything out. I'm sure over time we'll get that. My guess is it's not just going to be throttle mapping and transmission mapping. My thinking is there will be a change to the damper setting. Now, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, the biggest impact of this coming Sport Plus mode would be a stiffer setting within the adjustable dampers. The goal here for you and I would be a larger delta between Comfort and Sport Plus modes. While we're talking about the setup underneath the vehicle, I did have the opportunity to crawl under the car while I was there. Don't know if I was supposed to do that. The rear, no surprise, multi-link, kind of what we saw in the GV80 and the G80. Up front, a very intricate set of double wishbones. Aside from the sibling rivalry, a theme that will be coming up frequently throughout this design and tech review will be the Porsche Macan. And no, not generally because the goal in terms of driving dynamics is a Porsche Macan. Rather in terms of size and design, let's start with size. The vehicle, you haven't really seen it in person yet, so best way to describe it would be compare it to a vehicle that you've seen on the street, and that would be the Porsche Macan. It's about that size, which means about 110-inch wheelbase. In terms of construction of the vehicle, there it's a bit of divergence from the Porsche Macan. Here it's very much a Hyundai Kia Group product, so that means a lot of high-strength steel. But to go a couple of steps further in lightweighting by targeting key components to change the materials of construction. So think the hood and the liftgate, large body panels on this vehicle, those are both aluminum. While we're on the topic of the hood, that's a whole nother area that brings up this whole Macan theme. And yeah, you're probably looking at me like, wait a minute, that's not a clamshell hood. It doesn't look anything like a clamshell hood. What the hell are you talking about? Turns out there are some finer details that reveal themselves to you when you see the car in person, specifically from the front or the front three quarters. One of the biggest is the way the hood extends over the headlights, and there's a small gap there, giving it the impression of a clamshell hood. Then, as you and I have seen over the past year, as Genesis has evolved its design direction, they've adopted this parallel line motif. It starts with the lights, but this is another area that gives off the impression of a clamshell hood. There's a space that picks up from that design detail we just talked about that goes almost all the way to the base of the windshield, and then that line continues through the rest of the car. Now, most importantly, when it comes to design, the proportions are right here. I would argue this, from a front three-quarter, is one of the more attractive of this whole new design direction of Genesis. However, the rear. And I've kind of seen some of the comments you guys have left in GV80 episodes, as well as G80 episodes, talking about this car. And some of you had said, hey, it looks like a 928. Now, as a Porsche 928 aficionado, I cannot agree with that because the rear proportions of a 928 are totally different. And when you see this car in person, to me at least, it looks nothing like a 928. Then I can see how some people would look at this and say, once again, Porsche Macan, especially with the proportions. It's closer to a Porsche Macan with that rear 3/4. But you might murder me for saying this. The rear, when you see it from first glance, in pictures and even in person, I can't help but thinking AMC Pacer. Inside, I would argue, is absolutely the biggest step forward. Now, why do I say that? Well, for a couple of reasons. First thing, it's not one of these nesting doll approaches like they do with BMW or Mercedes. Here, you very much can see the Genesis DNA, meaning all the switchgear, which was unusually good in the GV80 and the G80. But here, it's got its own personality, and I would argue significantly more organic, which is kind of a theme that we see throughout this vehicle, to the point where I would say this is the better interior out of the three, and I know this is supposed to be like the more basic one. Some of the details that stand out, like look at the vent. It's kind of hidden here, but the vent, the actual satin chrome trim line, picks up and goes up and over the instrument binnacle. Very neat touch, and that organic detail is repeated throughout all the knobs throughout the vehicle. Count them, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in this specific case, once again, the detail here is a bit better than the GV80 and the G80 in that this knob kind of looks like a fine Swiss watch, to the point that I would say some of the learning that we're seeing here like this should make its way to the other siblings because it's that much better. Now, in terms of color and trim, fit and finish, that's very similar, kind of on par to the GV80 and G80 we've already seen. Here it works a bit better because of the more organic shapes, like specifically with the center console. The seat's very similar to what we've seen before, but here I'm going to hold judgment until we see the fit and finish of different trim levels because this one is a sport model. Okay, so let's you and I focus on a little bit of tech, and here there's some stuff we've seen before as well as some new stuff. Let's start with the stuff we have seen before. First and foremost, that 3D gauge cluster. I am just not a fan of this, really for two reasons. Number one, the 3D gauge cluster we saw in the Mercedes-Benz S-Class, far better than the one in the Genesis. And number two, much more importantly, the analog gauge cluster that is standard in like the Genesis G80 or GV80 is far nicer, especially when you consider that this is a luxury car. It's not trying to be an AMG, it's not trying to be a 911. I love the simple gauges that Genesis puts in these things. Let's celebrate them and let's not have the 3D gauges. Then there is a very unique way in which one can start the vehicle. Most of us are used to the key in our pocket, go up to the car. Usually it comes standard on most cars. On Porsches, they charge you extra for this. However, here, there's two ways to access the car and start the car. First, you get up to the car. We've seen in Hyundai Key episodes how they have the near-field communication with your phone or a card in your wallet, where you go up to the car, it opens the door, you can get in the car, and then start the car. Where here, it's a combination of the near-field communication to get in the car, but then, very flash, your fingerprint to start the car. So you really don't need to give your friends, whoever's going to be driving this car, a key. They can have a digital key for the phone and then set up their fingerprint to start the car. This is something I'm very excited to play around with. And then last, but certainly not least, something that I personally would not be very excited about, and that would be a speed limit control system. Now, this is not entirely new technology. We've experienced this in other cars as well as other Genesis. But what those systems do is read the speed limit information from the metadata from the GIS layer of the navigation system. In the GV70, it does something different. It doesn't use the navigation system, it doesn't even need the navigation system. Instead, it uses the cameras to read the speed limit signs. Now, I have said this before, and I will say it again. It's gotta suck to be a teenager with a driver's license because you can't have any fun. I remember back in the day, I was the moron trying to drag race my mother's turbo diesel Volvo. And yeah, I get it. This is great for parents or for someone loaning out their car. They want to set certain boundaries and parameters. But for those that want to have some fun, maybe we turn this system off. Okay, so that's about everything we know about the North American market, Genesis GV70. Everything else will have to wait until we get the car here in the hangar, we drive it, and better understand it from a technical point of view. That said, I do want to leave you with a couple of rather important thoughts. First and foremost, Genesis as a whole, not just this car, has made huge strides over a very short period of time. I don't mean since the Hyundai Genesis came out. I mean since we first saw the Genesis GV80, which was what? July of last year. Then we saw the G80, and really it wasn't so much the whole car or the whole design direction, it was the details. It was the color and trim, the fit and finish that really stood out about these vehicles. And what's happened here with this GV70 is the pace of change is now even faster. Now, yes, I want to say it is that big of a deal, but in reality, it's the contrary. It's a lot of very small changes that make the difference here, which brings us to the wish list. And here, the car, it's not even out yet, so it would be really foolish for us to provide some feedback on the wish list. The only thing I'm going to say here definitively is, yes, we do want the Sport Plus mode, and yes, we do want a stiffer setting in the dampers, so this way we could have more control over all the planes of motion, which was a problem with the GV80 and the G80. Other than that, this is where I turn the episode around to you to opine in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV, all one word, MotoManTV, all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I do have to kind of apologize to you guys because I got a very limited window of time to shoot this car. And yes, I'm very focused, I got to get all the detail shots. But while I was there, they brought something else. I can't tell you what it is yet. I didn't get to shoot it because I didn't have the time, but Santa Maria Madre de Dios. It is something to behold. Until I see you in the next episode, be später.